If you were to ask me 10 years ago whether I like playing computer games, I'd probably have fallen over myself to tell you all about why BioShock is still the greatest game ever made, and that people still treat computer games as some form of distraction therapy rather than the high art they are. These days, however, I'd actually have to take a moment to consider whether or not I actually do. The most recent game I actually played to completion was Untitled Goose Game earlier this year, but before that it was probably Inside in 2016. And since I started making computer games, I found that I play them significantly less. Moreover, the games I tend to play are things like The Vanishing of Ethan Carter or Firewatch, walking simulators with puzzle elements. That seems to be the underlying theme here. I really like puzzle games. And walking simulators, I guess, but mainly puzzle games. Whether it's Tomb Raider from the heady days of my youth or Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes, which was my gateway for getting into computer game design, I've always liked a good puzzle. This is probably most evident in my oeuvre of produced games, the vast majority of which involve puzzles of some description. So I guess it was sort of inevitable that I was eventually going to fall back on a relatively tried and tested format for this project. Bearing that in mind, project number 4 is now completed and available to download from itch.io, link in the description and all that jazz. Project number 4 is a semi-open world first-person puzzle game set on an attractive island which houses the ruins of some ancient civilization. And it wins a special prize for having the least imaginative name of all time, The Island. This segues nicely into letting me talk about the process of naming games for a couple of hundred words. Honestly, naming games isn't as easy as you might think. Yahtzee has actually talked about this in his most recent Dev Diary video, so I won't rehash everything he had to say on the subject, but suffice to say, you ideally want something memorable and descriptive without being dull or overly obvious. I've often thought that if you have to think too hard about a title, it's the wrong title. For the previous 3 games in this series, the only one that didn't just pop into my head fully formed was The Marvelous Adventures of Marvin Starr. Daedalus sounded cool and mysterious as befitted the style of the game. Marvin Starr was a fun and quirky game and sort of childlike, with a title to match. And A Shot in the Dark, as I may or may not have mentioned last time, was the title of the main menu soundtrack, a piece of music by Henry Mancini, which doubled up as a nice play on words for the game's title. But for this one, I really didn't know what to go with. The project folder was simply called Open World Thing, and the codename or working title was The Trials of Samuel, which didn't fit with the finished product at all. I could have gone for something pretentious and non-committal like with Extremis, more on that in a second, but honestly, having sort of already done that with Daedalus, and with the puzzles in the game already having suitably snooty titles themselves, something simple and to the point seemed to make the most sense. You certainly can't argue that it doesn't give you any information, even if it does share its name with a terrible Michael Bay film from 2005. So The Island it is. A game where you wander around listening to the lovely music and admiring the pretty scenery, whilst attempting to solve 4 original puzzles, each of which has narrated clues to solving them hidden somewhere in the overworld. I say 4 original puzzles, it's actually only 2, as 2 of the puzzles I had previously created for my unfinished project Extremis. I reprogrammed them from the ground up to keep in line with the rules of this challenge, but the central premise for each of them is identical to the original. Actually, The Island is a lot like Extremis in many ways. The setting is the same, the ambience is similar, the core mechanic of solve X unconnected puzzles is the same. I mentioned last time that I became a victim of my own ambition with Extremis, ended up getting disillusioned with the whole thing and ultimately not finishing it. Additionally, a couple of the puzzles felt slightly contrived, and there were so many buggy fringe cases in various parts of the gameplay, and I didn't want to commit to hunting them all down and fixing them. Admittedly, I was much more naive as a programmer back then as well, and I've learnt a huge amount since, which made The Island a much more manageable experience. The most obvious one is that instead of committing to 8 puzzles from the beginning and designing the overworld around that fact, I instead only committed to 4, 2 of which I knew from the start. I've also kept UI, controls and mechanics to the bare minimum. Move, run, jump, interact. That's it. No live system, no drowning if you fall in the water, no game over state, and a pause menu that consists of resume and main menu. Sometimes the KISS, or keep it simple stupid theory, really does work. although the payoff from that is that without any graphical settings options, you might struggle to get a smooth frame rate if you're running a potato. I ran it on my testing laptop, which is far from cutting edge, and managed a smooth 60 FPS, so something mid-range from the last year or so will probably be enough to manage. I don't want to spoil the puzzles themselves in case you want to go into playing it blind, and to be honest, there's actually not that much to talk about from a puzzle creation point of view. The nuts and bolts of the puzzles was probably the fastest part of the creation process, and all 4 were actually finished, mechanically speaking, when I was writing the last video. The interesting thing here is almost certainly the overworld. Unity is a pretty powerful piece of software, but if it weren't for the various plugins and tools available from the asset store, I'd wager that relative novices like me would have a much harder time making stuff that looks nice. The island is a perfect example of this. Pretty much everything you see in the game comes from an external tool or asset, each of which I'll talk briefly about. First of all, the ruins come from the Ancient Ruins asset pack. Things like this are great for quick projects, as more often than not you can simply drag and drop the ready-built prefabs into your project like a giant Lego kit. Of course, the big one here is the overworld itself. This wasn't quite drag and drop, but for how easy the tool in question is to use, it may as well have been. This is actually courtesy of a tool called Gaia Pro, a terrain terraforming tool that allows you to create amazing, realistic looking worlds literally in minutes. There's a video kicking around on this channel somewhere that showcases a few of these tools and how quick and easy they really are to use, which is worth checking out if you'd like some more info on the process. Having gotten the basic shape of the overworld and being happy with my trees, details and water, again all of those nature assets are from Gaia Pro and are spawned automatically in line with predefined or customizable rules, it's then textured with CTS or Complete Terrain Shader, an amazingly powerful texturing library far superior to the standard Unity ones, which really helps the terrain textures to stand out. I then added ambient skies to get some really powerful one-click post-processing effects and a pseudo AAA look. This does actually use the Unity standard post-processing tools, but ambient skies lets you add everything with a single click, saving a whole load of time. Finally, the icing on the cake is the volumetric light in the shape of Aura 2, which just looks so sexy. The list of tools could go on, and in many cases often does, in terms of adding more detail and realism to your world, but I figured for a short project that would probably do it. Actually, the endless parade of tools is something of a double-edged sword to people like me, who are happy to sit and play around with everything they offer. At one point, it occurred to me that after spending upwards of 90 minutes just fiddling around with the lighting and the sea settings to get it just right, I hadn't actually progressed any further with the project, and the scene didn't look significantly better or worse than before I'd started fiddling around with it. It's very easy to get suckered into enjoying the colours, so to speak, that before you know it you can lose sight of the bigger picture. This is almost certainly something I've been a victim of on my other big project, though having now identified it, it's maybe something I can avoid when I get back to it. I guess we'll see about that in due course. Finally, bugs. Oh god, the weird bugs. This is perhaps another double-edged sword case of using third-party tools to control stuff that you're not quite familiar with how to use. Yes, it takes a lot of the hassle out of large chunks of the creation process, but my goodness me, it can lead to infuriating bugs that have error messages you struggle to even read, never mind go on to solve. At one point, in fact for pretty much the duration of the development process, I was stuck with an issue whereby the game would crash every time the character went underwater. I decided to put a pin in it and leave it until later on, as it looked very much like a compatibility problem with the third-party tools. In truth, I didn't so much fix the issue as I did bodge my way around the symptoms of it. In short, one of the Aura lighting components didn't like the fact that the post-processing profile changed when going underwater. Taking the Aura light away fixed the issue, but then I didn't have the pretty volumetric light. I couldn't nail down the exact root of the problem, so in the end elected for a nice middle ground solution of switching the Aura light component off whenever the player character dropped below a certain height, i.e. the player is underwater, since being underwater meant the light wouldn't really be shown anyway, even if it was working properly. However, because you can jump into the water from a great height and technically get your character lower than the cutoff point before the script has had a chance to update and disable the problematic component, the cutoff point ended up having to be slightly higher than the actual water level. You can see this by walking slowly into the water whilst looking at the sun. just before the change of post-processing happens when you submerge, you'll notice the volumetrics switching off. Clearly, this is far from an ideal solution, but it did seem to get around the symptoms of the issue. I have no qualms telling you about this here, incidentally, and indeed encouraging you to check it out in the build of the game, because it's an interesting testament to the advantages and pitfalls of using third-party tools, especially when combining more than one of them. Fortunately, the guys at Procedural Worlds, who make Gaia Pro and CTS, have excellent customer support and good working relationships with the creators of other compatible tools like Aura 2, meaning when these compatibility issues arise, they're usually ironed out pretty quickly. So wrapping up the island, we move right along to project number 5. After a couple of fairly ambitious projects, I'm scaling things right back down for the next one, and I'm going to be putting a hopefully interesting spin onto a classic board game. It's going to be another multiplayer affair, though with single player compatibility, meaning there's going to be AI writing involved. I'm also considering adding some sort of Twitch integration into it, meaning people will be able to play it via Twitch chat during a live stream. I may not put that into the final release, but if I do, it'll certainly give me a lot to talk about. It's all part of my plan to take baby steps towards releasing an online networked game, which must surely be coming at some point. Full disclaimer, this is another overlappy project that I've actually already started and I'm pretty close to completing, hopefully before the pseudo deadline of the 22nd of July, which would get me right back on track. As ever with these things though, we'll see how well I manage the inevitable distractions before committing wholeheartedly to getting another video done within 9 days. Fingers crossed, and I'll see you in the next video.